you mentioned technology transfer and the need to identify willing partners that can then, that are willing to pair up with African local manufacturers. It's been said that we can no longer rely on the goodwill of the technology provider to want to do it in order to do something good for Africa, that we have to be proactive by creating incentives that would actually be attractive to potential partners. So how are we changing the game? What is the thinking around the kind of incentives that might be attractive to the kind of potential partners we might be interested in seeing early on coming on board to help push this initiative forward?
So while one can address this question in a COVID-specific way, I think the principles apply more broadly to how one goes about building vaccine capacity on the continent, or anywhere else for that matter, in a sustainable way. So the first point at which to start, and the way I like to frame this, is that when we talk about vaccine production capacity, we should talk about two sides of the same coin. The one is building it. What does it take to establish it? And the other side of the coin is what does it take to sustain it? Because establishing something and not being able to sustain it as an ongoing concern operationally is a waste of time, effort, and money. So one actually should start with the second point first, and that is, what is the model for sustainability? Now, we all know that unless governments or some generous entity says, don't worry, I will pay for whatever you need, that takes care of the sustainability issue then, okay? But in the real world, it never happens that way. You need to create a business case, you need to create an investment case, and I am not a financial person or an expert in economics at all, but we all understand that in order to have a going concern as a business, and I'm not talking about making obscene profits now, I'm just talking about keeping the lights on, that you need someone to buy your product. And so this is a key issue for everyone to appreciate when we talk about this whole challenge of building vaccine production capacity on the continent, that the countries and the continent needs to come together and create an ecosystem which enables the investment of time, effort, and money in building this thing over time, which means that there needs to be a commitment to buying the product from wherever these capacities are going to be built on the continent. Now, this then immediately and unavoidably takes you to a big conundrum. And that is, of the 54 or so countries on the continent, around about 40 of those countries depend completely or partially on UNICEF for their supply of vaccines. And because they're getting these vaccines free of charge or at very discounted rates, there is very little power in the hands of those African countries to say, don't worry, Biovac Senegal or wherever we might decide to put up these COVID production centers, the decision to buy does not lie with them. The decision to buy lies with UNICEF or with Gavi, etc. And that's one of the things that needs to be discussed, debated, and reshaped to enable and incentivize this dispersion of capacity geographically across the world, and obviously from an African-centric perspective, particularly in Africa. So the first thing, in my opinion, would be to focus on the market and how this market could be shaped, what the procurement mechanisms ought to be in terms of ensuring that wherever there are investments towards building this capacity in Africa, that they can be enabled and sustained over time. And from there, the rest of the picture emerges.
Just talk a little bit about the market, because that's a very important piece of the ecosystem that is needed for a viable, sustainable vaccine manufacturing industry on the African continent. I mean, like you rightly point out, the African market is controlled by UNICEF and Gavi. I believe they are accounting for 2/3 of the vaccines purchased in that market. And from what we can see so far, the way they've been buying vaccines over time, you mentioned that you have been sounding the alarm for 10 years. There has been very little indication or interest in procuring vaccines in a way that supports the development of local production by those global procurement mechanisms. I just wanted to ask your opinion or the thinking, what you're hearing, why we should be optimistic that these businesses like UNICEF and Gavi, because that's what they are, even though we call them, non-governmental organizations, why would they be willing to cede ground in their control, their share of the African market, to do something that they haven't been willing to do before? Why would it be different this time?
I'm not a political strategist at all. But I think that just in very simple terms, we need to identify what possible levers there might be for us to engage. We need to engage with a sense of realism about what can be achieved, but we also need to engage with a sense of optimism in terms of creating a new way of working, and with patience that this is not going to happen overnight. I don't think that that there's been a better opportunity than the one that we're currently immersed in. And it is very debatable, and in my opinion, highly unlikely that if we allow this window to pass, that the focus on the vaccine issue in Africa will present itself again as a priority issue. We know, and this is human nature, so this is not finger pointing at governments or any particular institutions, but we know that the voice that shouts the loudest gets the attention. Currently, it's the vaccine voice. Over the last 10 years, it wasn't. And that was part of the AVMI experience. I think intellectually, there was an appreciation that this is an issue, but because it wasn't the loudest voice, and because the urgency could not be grasped, I think COVID-19 has delivered that urgency. And I think that not only on the African continent, and not only by AVMI and the African CDC, etc., but these conversations are beginning to be held more frequently. And I think that these are not issues that I believe are foreign to Gavi or foreign to UNICEF. And I think that it really provokes a bigger question about how do we as people, as organizations, and as countries respond to a human health catastrophe. This is a humanitarian issue, and what are the things that we are going to prioritize over and above that? And I think that on the other side of this, we will see a view that we'll either be proud of or we'll be disgusted by it. And I think I'm hoping that to a measure, it will bring out the best in most of us to say that, yes, we have to think about sustainability. We have to think about companies operating on a profit, but we also have to think about, but how do we not compromise the impact on human health while doing that? I'm not suggesting that I have the magic wand answer to how this should be addressed, but I think fundamentally it demands that of us as human beings to say, what more can we do to ensure that not another life is lost unnecessarily when we have the solution in our hands?
Yes, I think even when you look at routine immunization, that need is bigger beyond the immediate crisis that we are facing of the COVID pandemic and other pandemics that we can anticipate in the future. At the moment, Africa presents one of the largest remaining global growth opportunities for vaccine expansion. So that's good news, at least for this initiative, that we still have 9.4 million children who are unvaccinated or under-immunized within the African continent. And that's a gap that has existed before we had this crisis, and a gap that we certainly need to do something to close. So at least from that perspective, the market argument is strong in terms of the needs for the crisis and beyond the crisis. So do you think, if this argument, the fact that we've had children that are under immunized prior to the pandemic, all of those things together, the crisis and the routine immunization needs that are unmet, how much do they strengthen the case for local production in your view?
Yeah, so I think obviously this whole discussion is a very nuanced discussion. There are no simple one-liners that can address any particular issue. As much as we like to grab onto the sort of one-line statement and say, okay, this is what we run with, these are very, very complex issues. So when one looks at vaccine production, capacity and in Africa over recent years with respect to routine immunization, my understanding is that it has not been a production issue of vaccines in Africa that has held back or slowed down on the coverage, the vaccine coverage of routine vaccines. There is a big issue with respect to the immunization programs, and that in itself is a major area of challenge in terms of, even if you had the vaccines in your hand, how do you get it to the child out there that needs it on schedule? And so I think it is a very, very, as I said, nuanced discussion. But what I would like to sort of steer the conversation towards is that we need to look at this thing, and you used the word an enabling ecosystem earlier. So we need to look at this thing as an integrated ecosystem that has many different facets to it, but all of it needs to work together in an integrated way. So the program side needs to be humming nicely. The procurement side needs to be humming nicely. The ability for the markets to buy the product needs to be nice and shiny and in place, and the capacity to manufacture. And we need to look at this in perhaps from a vaccine production point of view, in terms of routine vaccines, routine immunizations. And we're not saying that Africa must produce every single vaccine dose that it requires, because I think it's totally unrealistic. And I don't think any country actually does that. So there is an interdependency. But we need to look at the routine vaccines. We need to look at pandemic vaccines. And under that, obviously, top of the list now is COVID. But what are we going to do if and when another pandemic or near pandemic situation arises? What are we going to do about it then? So we need to look at routine vaccines, pandemic vaccines, and then we need to look at some vaccines that might be more of an issue, not because they become routine, not because they are pandemic, but because they have African relevance and they are required from time to time in different parts of Africa. And so we need to look at that whole product portfolio and see where the opportunities lie for this capacity building to take place. So So I think that what we'd like to see at the end of the day is some routine vaccines made, certainly capacities in Africa to ramp up in a kind of a surge production mode as and when required, and then some capacity to make vaccines that might be of African relevance specifically. And this needs to be distributed. I don't believe it should be in one place only, one company, one country, but it certainly doesn't need to be in 10 different countries. So we need to find the balance between where do we start, and how do we then plot that growth in terms of the number of sites in Africa?
Certainly. I think the point you make about having a portfolio of different vaccines that meet various needs that exist, from routine immunization and those products that are needed on a sporadic basis, is certainly a very important point. And of course, we would need to think about what happens in between pandemics, how you keep that capacity going, so that you have that capacity to ramp up and have to surge capacity when you need to in a crisis situation. We will talk a little bit more about that later, but let's just stay on the issue of the ecosystem. So an integrated regulatory environment is one of the critical components, right? If you have a market as large as the African continent, 54 countries, it gets complicated. So you need that integration of the regulatory environment and of the market itself. And it seems that we now have those institutions. The African Medicines Agency could become operational within 6 months, maybe early 2022. We have the African Continental Free Trade Area that is going to absolutely transform the way local producers can do business and with the vaccines that they manufacture. So what are some of the significant barriers that you still see, apart from the market, the regulatory environment, that you think are needed to transform this and bring us closer, a step closer in the direction we need to be moving?
So then, assuming that we have a business case on the table, an investment case on the table, and that, as you say, let's not talk about the market anymore, it's solved, miraculously it's solved, it's in place.
I'm not saying that.
But I think what we so that we don't circle back to that critical issue over and over again. But for a moment, if we dream that let's not talk about the sustainability thing now. Let's just talk about how do we establish it. What are the critical things required for the establishment of it?
Yes.
Other than the market, the procurement, and the regulatory factors, which you've highlighted, are critically important as enabling factors for this ecosystem. I think that I'll just rattle off a few things. It's infrastructure, it's equipment, it's technology, it's skills and know-how, and it's access to finance. Okay, so obviously finance is the common thing for each of the other four that I've mentioned. Yes. Skills development, the infrastructure investments, et cetera, et cetera. But assuming that you have an investment case on the table, what you're looking at is a period of time to build it. Now, where we are in this challenge, where there's a tension, and rightly so, in terms of all the political stakeholders and others saying, what can we do now so that tomorrow we have something in our hands? And realistically, there's only so much that can be done in the short term. So I think so. Let's talk about a short term and a long term perspective. So for the short term, my opinion is that one needs to go to where the capacities currently exist analyze and evaluate what those capacities are, identify the opportunities to accelerate expansion and capacity building to enable some COVID-19 vaccine manufacturing almost immediately or in the short term. And we can argue about what the short term is. Is it 6 months, 12 months, 18 months? But let's just discuss it under this fuzzy label of short term. Once you do that, you can then say, okay, now I can take a step forward that has a relatively short term impact and payback. And that, by definition, I think, is going to assume that you have a willing technology transfer partner that will be prepared to send you drug substance, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, for local full finish. That is the quickest way to do it. Now, once you say, okay, I've explored that, I've identified the opportunities, and it can be done at A and B, and now we need to find a partner, we need to put money into that, we need to ensure that investment is made in skills development, because somebody needs to be there to absorb that technology and implement it locally, buy the equipment, and even a simple thing that even if you had all the money in the world today, and you needed and you wanted to roll out vaccine production ASAP, ordering equipment could take you 12 months. So even if you had the skills in place, even if you had the building in place, even if you had a willing partner for the technology, and you had all the money in place, getting the equipment there to work the process could take you 6 or 12 months. So I provide insight into all of these issues just to provide a glimpse of the complexity of things, that is not simply about money. It's not simply about finding a partner. It's not simply about access to technology, etc., etc. Then I think that we need to come up with a plan that says, now what is the longer term thing? And the longer term thing vision must focus on end-to-end manufacture. And there are two ways in which to deliver that. One way is to start from scratch and develop a product yourself, be it COVID or whatever else. That, in the best of situations, could be a 5 or 10-year project to deliver a commercial vaccine. But the quicker route is, again, a technology transfer, but this time not only for full finish, but for the end-to-end, for the drug substance, the API, as well as for the drug product, the final product. So these are where the opportunities lie to engage with and then shift this thing forward. I do think as well that an important, and this is a strategic long-term view that we need to lock onto, is investment in vaccine development capacity. And without investment in vaccine development capacity, we're not going to break the cycle of dependency completely, because we will forever be dependent on a willing technology transfer partner in order to make vaccines on the continent.
Absolutely. So the political commitment, I think, to invest in developing those R&D capacities that is going to give you that long-term pipeline of potential products that you can then rely on and build on to build a sustainable industry, obviously is going to be very critical. So do you think the progress that has been made with institutions like the AMA, the Africa CDC, are they an indication of deepening political commitment towards doing what is necessary to establish a viable pharmaceutical industry that could maybe give us an idea whether there is going to be commitment to create those capabilities like R&D that we need?
Yes, so it's yes and no. So let me answer yes first so that I don't start on a negative footing. I think it's remarkable that the African CDC, as an agency of the African Union, under the leadership of Dr. John Nkengasong, has done what it has done to date. It's really been groundbreaking. I think they've been very successful in galvanizing and herding the cats, as it were, successfully behind this vision of building capacity in Africa. To the extent that this is not a debate about if we should do it any longer.
Yeah.
No one talks about that now. That's not the question on the table. The question on the table is, okay, now the hard work starts in how do we do it? What's the plan? So I think that we've made a good move out of the starting blocks.
Yes.
We are waiting with great expectation, and this is not just hope. I think that the African CDC has demonstrated its commitment to doing what it can and what must be done in order to make sure that this thing pushes forward. So I'm aware of some of the conversations behind closed doors, behind the scenes, as it were, but I don't think this thing has gone to sleep, and I think I'm depending on the African Union and the team at the African Union to keep this thing alive and well, and so that it flourishes, so to the extent that no one can ignore it. On the other hand, it's been a little bit disheartening, and you've spoken to Margaret about the African Medicines Authority. And it's disheartening in that countries have not been, let me say that they've been very tardy in signing up for it. And I think that as an early signal of African governments' commitment in a serious way to this, it's an easy thing just to put their signature to it, ratify it so that it can be a done deal and we move on. Because we're not in a season where we can kick things into tomorrow. Everything needs to be done today. And I think that collectively we need to learn from what has worked successfully elsewhere in the globe when we look at how where the successes have been secured for COVID-19 vaccine production, development and production. There was an urgency, money was thrown at it without asking questions, huge sums of money, and people mustn't lose sight of that, because without that risk investment, we could never have experienced the accelerated progress that we have currently experienced. And that is one of the reasons why some of these vaccines, against many people's better judgments, could be out there after 12 months, plus minus 12 months. I was one of those people who was very skeptical, thinking, 12 months, wow, that's going to take a miracle. And I believe it has been a miracle, because the ball bounced properly every time. That the first time around, those vaccines worked. It could be that maybe the spike protein wasn't the target to really focus on. But thankfully, those things all lined up and worked. But coming back to my fundamental point that I want to make here is that it needs urgent action. And urgent action means that before you drink your cup of tea, can we have a decision so that we can engage in the next action, please? And that's the first thing. And the second thing, it needs risk investment to really take this thing forward. because none of this is 100% guaranteed.
Absolutely. And of course, the danger here is that from what you say, your disappointment of how long it's taking for governments to put their, pen to paper and just ratify the treaty that is going to bring the African Medicines Agency into effect, is that when the crisis passes, things have a way of just lulling back to the status quo again. You get comfortable and it all gets forgotten until the next crisis. But certainly you've shared how your perception has evolved on local vaccine manufacturing. What are you most excited about, given the opportunities that are at the moment facing us, and what keeps you awake at night?
Nothing keeps me awake at night. I sleep very well.
Okay. All right.
So my way of working, my way of engaging with challenges is often internal conviction that something needs to be done, and we should go about doing what we can do in a way that does not depend on the responses of others. Now, that's very difficult to navigate because we all get despondent when things don't work out as expected, etc.
Yes.
But I think that I'm encouraged by the fact that there are enough key stakeholders that have been gathered around this issue. And again, the pivotal point seems to be the African CDC. And that conversation is growing in momentum. And I'm hoping that it would snowball to the extent that none of us can stand in its way. If we're going to try and obstruct this thing, it will just roll over us without apology. That for once, this is not a debate about if, it's a debate about how we're going to do it, and where we're going to do it, and what resources do we require. So that's where my optimism, that's where my excitement comes from, that like never before, Africa wants to do something. I've never heard anybody in Africa argue against the need for vaccine production, because fundamentally it's quite simple. Security of access, there can be no greater security of access than to make something yourself. And so for me, it's as fundamental as that. But I'm also a believer in steady, small steps forward. You just keep on walking. You keep on walking. And you do what you can. You connect with people who seem to have a like-minded vision, and who are willing to put their shoulders to the wheel. And collectively, I believe it can be done, and it must be done. The cost of not doing it is unimaginable.
I completely agree. And I like your approach of, just keep moving one step at a time, and don't look too much to what, people over there are doing, and just keep making what progress you can with the resources and stakeholders that you have who are willing to go with you. I think that's a really wise way to approach this. But what about the issue of active ingredients that you need? It's one of the biggest challenges for the pharmaceutical industry. The cost of APIs and presumably, for vaccines as well. India has been affected by the US banning the export of ingredients. How much of a problem is this going to be when, especially at the beginning? I understand the long-term vision is to have an integrated, complete supply chain, if you like, which produces the ingredients that are needed and the finished products. But at the beginning, how much of a problem is this of a challenge is this going to be for your efforts?
So I think that we are not going to escape that challenge just because we're Africans, and just because the world thinks, the world will rally around us and say, let's help Africa. I think it's a bun fight. in terms of securing access to these raw materials. And I'm not talking about active pharmaceutical ingredients now, I'm talking about the raw material inputs, disposable bags, filters, etc., etc. And I think that obviously there's a response from the manufacturers of these raw materials to scale up production, but there's always a lag behind that. And the issue is how do you plan for after the peak? In other words, this COVID vaccine demand is not always going to be a couple of billion doses annually, please. And so I think that the whole value chain needs to be looked at. I think that there is a case to be made from a continental perspective, or possibly looking at where critical raw materials could possibly also be manufactured in Africa, if there's a business case for that, what the complexities might be, how easy can it be to do that. But I think it's just part of the game. You know, you sign up to play this game, you have to deal with the way the thing unfolds. So we're not going to be immune to it, to use a vaccine term.
Yes.
But I think it's partnerships, very, very important. But at the end of the day, we all know it's the power of scale. If you as a supplier of a product have me knocking at the door wanting to buy one jar of something, but you have another customer wanting to buy 100 jars of something, you are going to supply the customer with 100 jars of something first because of your business interests. And I would have to then wait at the back of the queue. So I think that there is a need for us to create scale and leverage security of supply through that scale.